The lights blaze to life inside a vast hall in Geneva. For a fleeting heartbeat, the world seems to hold its breath. There's the unyielding stare of Donald Trump, looming behind a gleaming glass table, and a quiet but unbreakable resolve of Colonel Ibrahim Traoré, fingers interlocked as if ready to weather a lifetime of storms. A hush blankets the hall. Then, Traoré's voice slices through the silence like a thunderclap. You're not fit to lead the world. In that instant, tension crackles hotter than the noon sun over the Sahara. Georgia Whitman, the formidable architect of Western aid, slams down her dossier, the echo of her contempt reverberating off marble walls. Traoré lifts a worn photograph of his mother hauling water across a barren plain beneath an unforgiving sky. A collective ache, anger, and hope merge in the auditorium's tremor, raw and roaring like a pulse that can't be silenced. Screens around the globe flicker to life, broadcasting Trump's frozen expression. From Detroit to Dar es Salaam, ordinary people feel a spark ignite in their chests. This isn't politics as usual. It's a collision of raw memory and ruthless power. In 60 seconds, you'll witness a moment that ruptures the calm, ignites defiance, and makes us ask, who really deserves to lead? Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more moments that speak truth to power. The air in the Geneva Conference Hall shiver with expectation as bright beams from overhead spotlights carve stark lines across the table at center stage. A massive screen overhead pulsed. Live from Geneva, its cold glow mirrored in the delegates' solemn eyes. They arrive from every corner of the earth, drawn by the gravity of the showdown. At the head of the table, Trump leaned forward, cufflinks flashing like tiny daggers in the light. His voice dropped like an iron gavel. Leadership isn't for those who beg at the table, he pronounced, each word hammering the air. Opposite him, Colonel Ibrahim Traoré sat rooted, back straight, shoulders squared, gaze unflinching. His dark eyes, calm as a desert oasis at dawn, betrayed no sign of fear. On Traoré's right, James Mangy, once Rwanda's president, now a quiet dignitary, shuffled his feet, polished leather shoes tapping a nervous code onto the marble floor. On Traoré's left, Ambassador Linda Carter tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her pen hovering above her notes but never touching the page. Standing just behind them, Georgia Whitman pressed her earpiece tighter, listening for whispers of market tremors and social sentiment shifts. As vice chair of the Western Africa Cooperation Council, she embodied the West's unwavering belief in the authority of data. Her navy suit was tailored to severity, a gold pin glinting at her collarbone like a commandment. Her dossier, filled with projections and percentages, lay waiting, her shield against a rising tide of raw emotion. Camera cranes drifted in graceful arcs, lenses drinking in the smallest tremor of a lip or tightening of a jaw. The tension became something alive, a serpentine force coiled between the world's most notorious showman and a soldier who refused to yield. Trump's words still reverberated when a hush thick as fog settled. The delegates' pens hovered above their notepads, motionless. Not a single throat cleared. All eyes locked on Traoré. The world seemed to press inward, satellites beaming the quiet directly into homes from Nairobi to New York. Elderly veterans in Midwest community centers leaned forward in their chairs. Generations raised on political theater suddenly recognized what they were witnessing. Not spectacle, but primal test of dignity against bluster. A bead of sweat gathered on Trump's temple, slipping past a furrow of his brow under merciless lights. The silence was relentless, drawing out each heartbeat like a funeral drum. The conference hall's polished surfaces gleamed with almost cruel clarity. Every bead of sweat, every twitch laid bare for billions to dissect. Georgia Whitman's earpiece crackled with updates, trending hashtags, Dow Jones dips, Facebook Live reactions spiking. But the numbers sounded like distant rain compared to the electricity humming just beyond her pinched lips. She clutched her dossier tighter, ready to drown the spark with statistics if she had to. But Traoré made no move. His breathing stayed even, each inhale measured like a slow draw of a blade. He sat in that hush, a statue carved from conviction, letting the power of his restraint eclipse Trump's roar. 4 charged minutes. The room teetered between arrogance and resolve, between centuries of entrenched dominance and something altogether new. In that fragile quiet, an entire generation saw the cracks in old power's armor. They felt the hum of something bigger than politics, a promise of reckoning. Then, with a faint scrape of his chair, Traoré shifted back. The sound rang out like a shot in the silence. Cameras swung to catch his silhouette framed against the glowing projection screen. His hand hovered above the glass table, knuckles whitening, then lowered, deliberate and certain. His voice, when it finally came, seemed to crack the room's marble bones. "You're not fit to lead the world." The blast was instant. Ambassador Carter gasped, pearl earrings swinging as her hand flew to her lips. James Mangy leaned forward, the breath caught in his chest. On screens behind them, Trump's face froze, jaw clamped so tight it seemed to splinter under the weight of his own ego. A flush spread across his face, deeper than desert dusk. For the first time in decades, words deserted him. Georgia Whitman stood with glacial precision, slamming her dossier onto the glass. The crack was like a judge's gavel. "Colonel Traoré," she snapped, voice like chipped ice. "Stay within Section A budget allocations only." Her power was paper, percentages, pie charts, GDP forecasts. But those neat lines now trembled under the roar of raw truth. Far beyond Geneva, a retired auto worker in Detroit leaned closer to his TV, pride burning behind tired eyes. In a Long Island rec center, elderly women with knitting needles paused mid-stitch, nodding to each other in unspoken agreement. Online, the hashtag exploded. Numbers soared past the speed of any stock ticker. Traoré barely blinked at Whitman's rebuke. He let her command hang there like a toss gauntlet. The hall's walls swallowed every breath, every rustle of expensive suits. The rhythm of 1,000 heartbeats seemed to match the pounding in his veins. For minutes of silence had done what decades of political grandstanding could not. They had exposed a lie that power must always be loud. They showed that sometimes real leadership is forged in quiet defiance, in the simple, fearless act of standing unshaken. As Traoré lifted the faded photograph of his mother, once more, the world knew this was not just a clash of titans. It was the beginning of something far greater, a reckoning, live and raw, under the world's harshest spotlight. The cameras locked onto Trump's flaring nostrils and quivering lips. Traoré leaned forward, voice steady yet ringing with an unmistakable undercurrent of defiance. "You may quote your figures," he began, each syllable deliberate, "but numbers alone cannot speak for millions who've tasted nothing but hunger and hardship." He paused. The hush swallowed every cough and shuffle in the hall, his words settling on the delegates like a layer of dust dancing in a sunbeam. Behind him, the sleek emblem of the Western Africa Cooperation Council gleamed, a polished promise of unity that now felt brittle and hollow. This was meant to be a bridge-building summit, but Traoré's gaze made clear that bridges built on empty assurances crumble under the first honest storm. Across the table, Trump regained a shred of composure. He leaned in, elbows planting onto the glass like stakes in the earth. His lips parted, ready to unleash the thunder of his signature bravado. But what emerged instead was a strained rasp that barely carried to the nearest microphones. "You don't understand power," he murmured, each word sharp as a knife in old wounds. It was an accusation older than the walls of that conference hall, a relic of colonial swagger that claimed the West alone held the keys to global order. Traoré's mouth twitched into the faintest of smiles, but it was not mockery. It was the quiet certainty of a man who knew the price of every truth he spoke. "Power," he echoed, the single word rolling like distant thunder over the hushed room, "is meaningless without humility." The astonishment that followed was visible in the darting eyes of aides rifling through folders, in the rigid posture of moderators frozen at their microphones. Even Georgia Whitman's fingers hesitated at the edge of her laser pointer, her immaculate notes shuddering as the moment slipped beyond the control of charts and statistics. For those charged minutes, the air in Geneva transcended the politics that built its marble pillars. This was no longer a forum of technocrats, but a moral battlefield where sterile numbers collided with the raw weight of lived truth. Delegates who had arrived armed with calculators and briefing packets now found themselves stripped bare by the simple force of unvarnished humanity. Traoré spoke then of villages without clinics, of mothers who rose before dawn to trek 10 miles for a single bucket of water. His words painted images that flickered behind eyelids, Cracked heels on dusty paths, tired smiles bleached by an unforgiving sun, the mute plea in a child's eyes that needed no translation. Each phrase landed with the ache of memory. In the back rows, seasoned journalists leaned closer to their cameras, microphones recording the tremor beneath every consonant. Producers thousands of miles away whispered urgently into earpieces. This was no routine summit. This was a broadcast that would carve itself into the archives of history. Whitman, the eternal guardian of Western policy's neat boxes, finally cleared her throat. Facts are immutable, she asserted. Her voice clipped as she flicked a laser pointer toward the giant screens behind her. Bar graphs and pie charts blazed alive. Aid flows dissected by region. Percentages sorted into symmetrical wedges. But the delegates' eyes did not follow her pointer. They remained locked on the soldier, who stood defiant against a wall of data. Traoré's silhouette, dark, unwavering, glowed in the pale blue wash of the charts. His words cut through the sterile numbers like a blade through silk. "You can allocate dollars," he said, each syllable clear as frost under a desert moon. "But you cannot allocate dignity." The force of it pulsed under the polished marble floor. Trump's aides shifted in their chairs, ties tugged loose. One wiped the sweat that now pooled at his hairline. And in a small living room in suburban Ohio, an elderly woman pressed her fingers to her lips, tears welling up as she whispered prayers for a world her grandchildren might one day see. The hall seemed to exhale all at once. Chairs creaked, pens tapped. The oxygen itself buzzed with revelation. Camera lenses spun back toward Trump, capturing the storm in his eyes, a flash of disbelief edged with reluctant respect. Georgia Whitman, for the first time, stood motionless. Her dossier clutched her chest like a shield that had just split down the middle. Whether the council would choose partnership or remain chained to paternalistic tradition now hinged on her next words. But for the moment, she said nothing, her voice lost in the tidal wave of Traoré's quiet courage. Beyond Geneva, the world rippled in response. Social feeds flared like fireworks against a midnight sky. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers in cracked concrete. Debates ignited in comment threads. Opinion pieces drafted in the time it took to refresh a page. In Detroit, a retired firefighter switched off his TV and stood at his window, the city skyline blurred by tears of belief reborn. That true leadership could come from the humblest of journeys. In a tiny church hall in Lagos, a circle of elders huddled around a battered transistor radio. As Traoré's words crackled through the static, they rose to their feet, breaking into spontaneous applause, palms pressed together in silent blessing. Back in that gleaming hall, the young colonel's eyes stayed locked on the sea of lenses and curious faces. He did not shrink from a moment. He did not bow to the weight of the room's suffocating protocol. He met it head-on, draped only in the unyielding mantle of his own truth. Then, in a motion as delicate as it was devastating, Traoré slipped his fingers into the breast pocket of his crisp navy uniform. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as he drew out a photograph, creased at the edges, faded by sun and time. He held it aloft for every camera, every delegate, every living room thousands of miles away. The picture was painfully simple. A young African woman, her face etched by sun and sweat, balancing a clay pot atop her head as she trudged across a parched horizon. The sky behind her was a sheet of molten white. The path beneath her feet cracked and unforgiving. Traoré's voice wavered, just once, with something close to reverence. "This," he said, holding the photo steady, "is my mother. Every morning, she walked 10 miles for water, so her children could live." In that instant, the glare of spotlights and the crisp echo of officialdom melted away. The marble floors felt too cold, the glass table too sterile to contain the pulse of that image. The walls of Geneva's Grand Hall bowed to the truth of that dusty path. He told them of dawns where the world was still ink black, of bare feet that touched dry earth long before the birds stirred. He painted mornings where the rising sun was not a sign of warmth, but a cruel reminder of how far there was still to go. On Traoré's left, Ambassador Susan Blake pressed a trembling hand to her lips, eyes rimmed red. Michael Njori, the once proud president of Rwanda, lowered his gaze, the weight of old sins pressing into his shoulders. Even Georgia Whitman's laser pointer drooped, her slides a collage of sterile percentages overshadowed by a single mother's sacrifice. Traoré's story spilled out, soft and unflinching. Nights of hunger that gnawed like a living thing, memories of sleeping on dirt floors, rain pattern outside walls that could not keep it out. His soldier's uniform dissolved in that telling. In its place stood a boy who had once learned what love looked like measured in miles. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their flickering screens. A retired teacher in Vermont remembered her own mother working 2 jobs for decades. A coal miner's widow in West Virginia closed her eyes and wept for the same dawns that found her alone at a kitchen table. Traoré lowered the photo with the care of someone laying down a relic. It rested on the table, the past made tangible, a silent challenge to the glass and steel of modern power. He leaned in, fingertips brushing its edge. "My mother never asked for your aid," he said, voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "She asked for her dignity. She carried water so that we might drink. She endured hunger so that we might taste hope." His eyes shone, not with tears of weakness, but with a fierce glow of conviction that decades of politics could not touch. The tension fractured then, like ice shattering on a sunlit river. Around the room, officials stirred, eyes downcast, notes forgotten. Journalists scribbled like men and women possessed, desperate to catch every last syllable. Georgia Whitman's laptop snapped shut, the echo sharp and final. Michael Njori pushed back his chair, hand pressed over his chest in a gesture of respect older than any treaty. Ambassador Blake dabbed at her cheeks, her posture unguarded at last. Outside Geneva's glass walls, the world responded. Phones pinged and buzzed. Tweets bloomed with words like dignity and mother's miles. Clips of Traoré's voice spooled through timelines, replayed again and again. A grandmother in Phoenix pulled her grandchildren closer, whispering that real courage sometimes speaks not with thunder, but with a steady drip of truth. And as Traoré sat back, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, the photograph remained, its corners catching the light, its story a flame that would not be smothered by data or dogma. Minutes later, as the room's hum of conversation slowly returned, Trump finally spoke, and the world leaned in, waiting for the thunder to return. But no bombast came, only a grudging nod, a single line that carried a sliver of respect for a mother's 10-mile testament. That day, the Geneva Hall did not crown a victor with votes or declarations. It crowned a moment, the kind that reminds every soul watching that the currency of leadership is not just dollars and treaties, but the price paid in miles walked and water carried. And as the screens flickered off across continents, one truth glowed like the desert sun. The quiet strength of dignity will always outshine hollow power. Trump's words struck the polished table like a gavel. Continent, aid, and respect, he boomed, his baritone echoing the weight of 3 presidential terms, countless State of the Union addresses, and rallies fueled by the roar of adoring crowds. A stray beam of light caught the gold cuff of his jacket, casting a glint that looked like a line drawn in the sand between him and Traoré. Around the oval table, the lacquer would seem to drink in Trump's pronouncement reluctantly, as though the room itself understood this was not just a clash of policies, but of worlds. One world glittered with data charts, spreadsheets, and carefully crafted treaties. The other was paved with dust-choked roads winding through parched villages where a mother's dignity often weighed more than foreign currency. Traoré's lips curled into a tight, almost sorrowful smile, not a smirk of triumph, but the expression of a man who knew that some truths carried too heavy a price. He lifted one finger and tapped it lightly against the glass table. The soft tap cut through the air sharper than a raised voice. His reply came calm, steady, yet it rippled like a stone dropped into still water. "You gave what served you," he said, eyes locked on Trump's, "not what honored us." The word struck the chamber like a wave crashing on an ancient shore. Delegates glanced down at their nameplates, suddenly weighted with titles that now felt empty in the face of that unvarnished truth. Camera lenses whirred, tightening their focus to catch the flicker in Trump's eyes, a practiced composure buckling under quiet force of Traoré's honesty. Beside him, Georgia Whitman's grip on her silver pen whitened her knuckles. She tapped the pen sharply on her thick dossier, the crisp rap, like an executioner's drum. "Next slide," she ordered, voice clipped. "So cold to defrost glass? Program impact analysis." The massive LED screen snapped awake, casting the hall in a harsh blue glow. Bar graphs rose like glass towers, percentages stacked in bold columns, each sector neatly color-coded. Slices of pie charts spun into place, dissecting billions into digestible wedges. 60% for healthcare, 25% for education, 10% for infrastructure, 5% for contingencies. The screens gleamed with all the sterile promises of modern governance, accountability, oversight, measurable impact. And yet, the more the numbers glowed, the more they seemed to flicker like neon signs buzzing in an empty alleyway. Traoré watched the slides pass by, his gaze steady yet distant, as if he were seeing to the bright pixels to the bare earth beneath. When the charts gave way to embassy logos and budget projections, he pushed himself forward, palms pressing into the table's glass surface, as if to anchor himself to the truth that had carried him from the cracked dirt of West Africa to Geneva's marble floors. His eyes found the main camera at the far end of the table, the lens feeding this moment to living rooms from Boston brownstones to small-town ranch homes in Arizona. He let out a slow breath, then offered a smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen mirages his whole life, but still found beauty in the horizon. "Leadership isn't trophies," he said, his voice drifting to the cavernous chamber like a breeze stirring stale air. "It's humility." Silence fell, not the awkward hush of confusion, but the deep, deliberate quiet that wraps itself around a moment when souls recalibrate. Trump's mouth opened, an old reflex, then closed again. The master of jabs and verbal haymakers found himself cornered by something far harder to combat. The unwavering honesty of a man who knew that real power asked nothing for itself. Around the table, aides lowered their pens in unison, their scribbled notes suddenly feeling as hollow as the graphs on the wall. Whitman's silver pen hovered above her binder, frozen. The next slide glowed on standby but never came. Across from her, Linda Carter unclenched her fists, the tension in her shoulders easing as if a storm had finally passed. Michael Njori, the former Rwandan leader, sat up straighter, his nod small but telling, a concession that no metric in the world could capture the heartbeat of the people. Overhead, the LED lights hummed too bright, a reminder of the cold machinery of bureaucracy now dwarfed by the warmth of a human truth. A cameraman lowered his rig for a heartbeat, blinking at the raw gravity now thick in the air. In broadcast control rooms from New York to Nairobi, producers leaned forward, headset chatter falling silent, as they realized they were witnessing not just policy, but a reckoning. Outside the chamber, the hashtag Humility Not Trophies bloomed across timelines within minutes. Social media lit up in every time zone. Retirees in Florida care homes shared the clip with misty eyes. In Seattle coffee shops, heads bent over laptops, patrons nodded at the subtitles on loop. In Dayton, Ohio, a former principal whispered to her husband, "He's right, isn't he?" The tremor in her voice carrying the echo of decades spent fighting for kids who deserve more than promises scribbled in ink. Inside Geneva's grand chamber, Traoré's smile faded, replaced by a solemn calm. He squared his shoulders, the quiet posture of a man who knew that the silence now spoke for him. He let it linger, a benediction, not a threat. "Humility," he said again, softer this time, as if blessing the room rather than condemning it. He rested his hand on the table, fingertips brushing the smooth glass. The simple gesture closed a moment like a seal pressed into wax. Around him, chairs creaked. Pens clicked. The meeting's tempo restarted, but the rhythm was forever changed. Trump cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the swirling grain of the polished wood. The bluster that had carried him through trade wars and election nights was gone. When he spoke, his words were stripped of thunder, laid bare like bones. "Maybe," he said slowly, the word catching on his tongue, "maybe we have much to learn." No flourish, no pivot, just a small admission, but one that carried the heft of a man who, for the first time, let the truth in. Georgia Whitman exhaled, the set of her jaw loosening as she closed her laptop with a gentle click, a softer ending than any rhetorical flourish she could have conjured. The ambient hum of diplomacy resumed, but its undercurrent hummed to a different beat. For those who had witnessed it, the trajectory had shifted. What mattered now would not be measured in bar graphs, but in the weight of conscience. In that pause before the next agenda item, The Geneva Hall felt changed, a place where the voices of the once voiceless now echoed off marble walls. Outside, the world responded with tears and applause. In a student dorm in Paris, a nursing major clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wet as she replayed Traoré's words on her cracked laptop screen. In Detroit, a Vietnam vet, shoulders bowed by years and burdens, pressed a gnarled hand to his heart, chest heaving at the unexpected swell of belief that a single voice could bend the arc of power. Social feeds roared. Hashtag Traoré Trump trended by dawn. Clips of the colonel's closing line. Respect is earned, not given. And we, the people of Africa, demand respect. Looped on reels, reposted by retirees of Missouri as easily as they were stitched by college students in Nairobi. Inside the hall, the final hush settled over the polished table. Trump, once a towering figure in this very chamber, sat hunched, tracing a fingertip along the wood grain, his bravado folded into a fragile, unfamiliar quiet. Georgia Whitman gathered her slides in silence, no victorious snap, just a soft rustle of paper that felt more like surrender. Traoré stood alone, shoulders squared as if he carried the whole of his continent on his back. And perhaps, for a fleeting moment, he did. He met the eyes of each delegate, offering a single nod, a promise that this fight was not for spectacle, but for every mother who had ever walked miles for water under a burning sun. He glanced once more at the faded photograph resting on the table. His mother's silhouette, clay pot balanced high, her spirit unbroken by the relentless horizon. With that, he turned and stepped into the corridor beyond, where aides and journalists surged like a tide desperate for his next word. Outside, the closing credits rolled across the broadcast as a gentle, stirring score rose, strings humming hope and grit in equal measure. The lens lingered on the photograph, now haloed by a single spotlight, a reminder that true leadership isn't forged in wealth or applause, but in the dignity carried by those who endure. Across time zones, viewers whispered promises to themselves and each other. For Americans over 50, many who remember their parents' quiet sacrifices, the Geneva moment rekindled an old truth, that real leadership is found not in the trophies we hoard, but in the humility we live by. So, as the last words faded from the screen, the message remained, a spark carried in comment sections, coffee shop conversations, and family phone calls. Let it remind us that respect must be earned, that power must serve rather than consume, and that real change begins when even a single voice dares to speak truth to the world's mightiest rooms.